And we start in New York City. At this point, the U.S. President Donald Trump is making his maiden speech at the UN General Assembly. Listen to him just very briefly earlier. He's been talking about the basis of mutual respect between and among countries and also America First principle. The leaders are gathering there for the 72nd United Nations General Assembly. U.S. President Donald Trump is delivering his first speech before the world body. He's also likely to tackle some of the other issues ranging from nuclear and missile testing by the DPRK to ongoing civil wars in Syria and Yemen. We'll see whether the issue of Iran is also likely to be touched on by him during his first speech to the UN General Assembly in New York. Joining me to talk about the key points of his maiden speech over there, we have in our Beijing studio Teng Jianqun, Director of the American Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome to our program. Also in Beijing, Rick Dunham, who's co-director of a global business journalism program at Tsinghua University, certainly a very seasoned Washington journalist, used to be there for decades in Washington. And in Boston, we have Jim Walsh, Security Studies Program with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Of course, the speech is still going on, and yet there are already some points jumping out for us to take a closer look and put some analysis here. He talked about America First, the U.S. President Donald Trump. Of course, he has been criticized heavily about this slogan, yet at the UN General Assembly, he did win some applause. How should we understand this, Mr. Walsh?
Well, when you come to a Donald Trump speech, the first question you have to ask yourself is, which Donald Trump are you getting? Are you going to get one who stays on script and tries to appear presidential? Or are you going to get a guy that's going to freelance and complain about perceived slights and sort of rant? Well, we've got some answer now. For the first several minutes of this speech, he has been the presidential Donald Trump, which we don't see very often. He's sticking to his speech. He's reading off the teleprompter. I think so far, so good. He hasn't said anything that would be particularly controversial or that others in the room might find insulting. So I would say that's the sort of Donald Trump we have right now, which is a surprise. At this
point, he is talking about DPRK. Let's listen in. North Korea.
His brother using banned nerve agents in an international airport. We know it kidnapped a sweet 13-year-old Japanese girl from a beach in her own country to enslave her as a language tutor for North Korea's spies. If this is not twisted enough, now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict. No nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary. That's what the United Nations is all about. That's what the United Nations is for. Let's see how they do. It is time for North Korea to realize that the denuclearization is its only acceptable future. The United Nations Security Council recently held 2 unanimous 15-0 votes adopting hard-hitting resolutions against North Korea, and I want to thank China and Russia for joining the vote to impose sanctions, along with all of the other members of the Security Council. Thank you to all involved. But we must do much more. It is time for all nations to work together to isolate the Kim regime until it ceases its hostile behavior. We face this decision not only in North Korea. It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country.
All right. Earlier, there have been remarks coming from the U.S. President Donald Trump during his first speech at the UN General Assembly taking place right now in New York. He's been talking about the U.S. stance on the DPRK. He has been talking about the UN Security Council resolution. He thanked China and Russia to join hands during that resolution. And he also talked about that's the legitimacy of the United Nations, which is to seek solutions to some of the thorny issues of the world. Having said that, though, he has also been talking about so-called destroying North Korea. He said the U.S. is ready, willing, and able to do that, and yet he said, we hope, quote, that is not necessary, and he's calling on the international communities to so-called, quote, isolate North Korea, while at the same time to seek a solution. He did not mention very specifically what the solution is. He did not mention about the U.S. obligation of approaching North Korea not only with sticks but also with carrots to seek solution for dialogue and conversations. Let's come back to our panelists. The three of you been with me, listening very attentively. Everything he said. There seems to be several layers that he's trying to lay out. Mr. Teng, as someone who's doing research for decades on the nuclear issue and a key expert from the Chinese side, what do you make of President Trump's speech, particularly regarding the DPRK and relations with China?
Actually, he repeated the U.S. position toward DPRK, especially in recent 7 months after he took the office as the President of the United States. Donald Trump actually so far has not yet got the clear-cut policy toward DPRK. This is only a repetition for the old policy toward including the cooperation among the major powers, among China, Russia, and the United States, and also some other choices still on the table.
I see.
And actually is a continuation of not so clear policy toward DPRK at this moment.
And he said specifically totally be able to destroy North Korea if the other side, from his perspective, is provoking further. How do you see that? Because China is in the neighborhood of North Korea, certainly.
Yeah, I don't think this is the first time for the president to say such a thing, to the outside world. And since February, when the tension initiated by the launch of missile and also the military drills by United States and ROK. The tension had been there, for at least 7 months. I think Donald Trump even said everything is okay, especially in the use of force against DPRK. And this time, actually, he just repeated the old policy toward DPRK. No new.
Do you agree, Mr. Dunham, that he repeated actually the previous stance?
I have a slightly different view.
All right.
I think that what he's not talking at all about is talks. This is his part of the speech when he's talking about North Korea.
There's no mention of that word at all.
That's right. No discussion, no peace talk, no anything. It's get rid of your nukes or we will destroy you. Now, you can't have a nuclear bomb that only affects North Korea. I mean, nuclear weapons could cross the line into South Korea, into China, into Russia. I think it's a calculated move on his part to sound so bellicose. I mean, it sounds like he went to the Kim Jong-un School of Diplomacy with his speech. So he's going one insult after another.
So who is he speaking about this to? Is he speaking to the so-called rocket man, which he always preferred to call Mr. Kim, or is he speaking to the international community? Remember, all the foreign ministers, presidents, prime ministers are sitting there, including foreign ministers from Russia and also from China. And also, we have head of states from many other countries over there, including the foreign minister of North Korea as well at the UN General Assembly. So who is he speaking to?
I think he has 4 audiences, One is the American people, probably the least important audience that he's speaking to. Or second, Kim Jong-un, he's talking to the North Korean leadership. Third, he's talking to the international community at large, saying this is the direction I'm going, whether you're with me or not. Fourth, China and Russia. He is saying no trade with North Korea. It's time for extreme action to make a change.
Okay, one word that he used, isolate. What Mr. Walsh, you probably could help us understand what exactly is this isolate mean? Does it mean not to deal with North Korea? But you know, how could you have peace when you do not deal with the other side of the controversy? And secondly, did he propose anything? Did he propose anything in the just delivered paragraphs related to DPRK?
No, I don't think he proposed anything. I did take notice of the fact that he went out of his way to thank China and Russia for the latest UN Security Council resolution. As for isolation, I think that's just traditional U.S. foreign policy tool here. By isolation, they mean diplomatic isolation, which you see this week. For example, Spain kicked out a ambassador from the DPRK, and then economic isolation. And you know, there have been those at in the American delegation at the UN who tried and failed to get an economic embargo against North Korea, which in traditional legal terms is, in the old days, used to be considered an act of war. You know, when we first spoke before we went to the UN, to his actual remarks, I was just saying what a surprise it was that he was reading a script and seemed presidential, or at least in relative terms. And then we go to this, his remarks, and he immediately starts to call him Rocket Man, and then, you know, it's very unusual for a president of the United States to get up before the United Nations and then threaten to destroy a country. Normally, speeches are not like that at the UN. So I guess he started off pretty restrained, but the more he goes on, the weirder, and I would say the more sort of direct and insulting he's become.
I see. UN General Assembly. A speech like this is usually being delivered by every head of state, 194 countries, and also represented from the so-called regions and places, all represented, all have their own 15 minutes. Of course, but this time, Mr. Trump tends to go a little bit longer than that. That is the time when everybody can say what's on their mind or what they want others to see what's on their mind. And nobody gonna prevent them from saying anything. Okay, that is the rhetoric. What about the real action, Mr. Teng? Right before the General Assembly speech given by President Trump, he spoke with Chinese President Xi Jinping on the phone. This is one of the many times that these two gentlemen spoke to one another. And they talk about their domestic issues, that they have both domestic big issues going on, but at the same time, touch on the DPRK issue. Of course, both sides did not elaborate as to exactly what is the content regarding to the DPRK they were talking about on the phone. But Mr. Teng, given your knowledge, how should we relate all of these things together?
Yeah, I think
what kind of map can we figure out now?
Yeah, I think the phone call has already become a routine job for the two presidents when they are going to talk about, relative issues like the DPRK and Paris Climate Accord and some other issues. They just picked up their phone and they had such a call. This is a very important routine arrangement for the two leaders to have a consensus in dealing with the challenge. For example, this time they touch upon the DPRK nuclear issue, and this is a real and direct threat for both countries, for China and for the United States. We should, face the reality. This is the reality. The direct and real threat from DPRK is the missile capability and the nuclear. And I think this time, even Donald Trump appreciated the position from China and from Russia, but I don't think he can afford the price to have a real war against the DPRK at this moment.
But Mr. Walsh, we did notice from Mr. Trump earlier, talking about the UN Security Council, we see that President Trump, from time to time, needs to have the support of the legitimacy of the UN Security Council. For example, on the issue of DPRK. And yet, on the other times, he
Yes.
seems to switch that position, suggesting the UN is not anymore that useful. Even though yesterday he was at the UN meeting talking about the UN reform, very much agreeing in line with the Secretary-General of the United Nations, Mr. Guterres, about that reform. But we see skepticism very strong from him. So how should we understand this quite divided position about himself, in a way, as the President of the United States? On the one hand, he does need legitimacy of the UN. On the other hand, he does not seem to like the UN, and he does not seem to be very interested in it. Briefly.
Yeah, well, I think that pretty much captures it. And this is not the first instance in which the president has held views that are in tension with one another. And sometimes he goes off and even offers views that are contradictory. So I think this is, it's ironic phrasing, but it's certainly consistent. Mr. Trump's inconsistency is fairly consistent. Now, in this case, I think he can wrap, in his mind, and here I must only speculate, but I'm guessing he's saying to himself something like this. He's combining the fact that he feels that other countries aren't carrying enough of the burden, the so-called burden sharing problem, and that other countries need to spend more and do more, and he's sort of pivoting into, with that theme, into the UN by saying, well, the UN should do more than it's doing, including reforming itself, but it should contribute more to helping the U.S. solve international problems. And so he gets to have a little bit of both at the same time.
Right. Of course, when we talk about
perspective.
President Trump, we always wanted to refer to his tweet, which is very personal. He did mock at the UN as being weak and incompetent and bad for the U.S. It is still there in his Twitter history. In December, he tweeted, the United Nations has such great potential, but right now it is just a club for people to get together, talk, and have a great time. So bad. Of course, he is there today and talked. And we are going to wonder what kind of tweet he's going to send later after this. But coming back to you, Mr. Dunham, that really shows what is likely to be this very entangled relation between the United States and the UN in the future. Not only U.S. and the UN, but also U.S. and the other international organizations, the international mechanism as well. Will he change after this? When he get the support of the United Nations Security Council on some of the most crucial issues that he considers, will he change?
Donald Trump is not changing. The one thing you saw today...
Well, you could be so firm about that.
Because he's saying the same things that he said during the campaign, but he's saying it more diplomatically. He was as undiplomatic as could be when it comes to North Korea and Iran, but when it came to his criticism of the UN, it wasn't at all like on the campaign trail when he was mocking and insulting, and in his tweets when he just criticizes the UN.
But people could just
freely.
say, well, you know, Mr. Dunham, you're from the American media. It is no secret the media doesn't like your president, right?
Well,
it's on
he
the
doesn't get very good coverage, that's
every
for
day.
sure.
And Mr. Walsh, of course, I mean, you are one of those American elites. Mr. Trump is now catering at you when he's delivering his speech. He's looking at those in the Midwest and someone so-called redneck. So no wonder that the two of you did not like your president. But he might get a lot of support back at home, Mr. Walsh.
Well, I would say that I would point out, you probably don't know this, that I came from very modest means. I was the first person in my family to go to college.
All right.
And so I am not given to elite by birth like a certain president I know. But, you know, I do think it's true that most foreign policy professionals have been skeptical about his competence and skeptical about his policymaking. I think that that's right.
We've been having some challenges. Try to incorporate some of the panelists into our discussion today from the United States. We understand the challenge that you are talking about, Mr. Walsh. Having said that, though, on a very serious note, Iran is also being touched by President Trump. And of course, there were a lot of harsh words against Iran. And French president was warning about this, saying if the Iran deal could not continue, the effect of it is going to be horrendous. Something like that earlier, right before the Security Council speech. So what kind of role, Mr. Teng, as a nuclear expert, should the U.S.
play
and China
in I think the U.S. Under the leadership of Donald Trump will change a little bit toward Iran at this moment. This is not a nuclear deal. This is actually a geopolitical competition. After the war in Iraq and after the destruction of Taliban in Afghanistan, actually Iran has already become the major power, the major region power in the Middle East. And the United States actually has been worrying about the future of the balanced power in the Middle East that might be changed by the rising of Iran. So this is not a nuclear issue. Actually, the nuclear deal, I think, has been a good deal among all the parties concerned. So
but
the United States...
But if that deal is not continuing, Mr. Walsh, as a scholar in nuclear issue, you understand that there's going to be ripple effects, and that's going to have a big impact on the DPRK issue as well. Any chance of peaceful solutions?
Well, certainly if the Iran deal goes away, it would make negotiating any sort of agreement with North Korea very difficult, because the North Koreans will rightly say, why should we sign an agreement if the U.S. is going to tear it up 2 years later? So I do think it has a direct impact on the Korean situation, or the prospects of solving that peacefully. And I think, decertification, if it happens, is going to happen mid-October, around October 15th. Clearly, the president wants to do it. He's being told by his entire cabinet and national security team not to break the deal, and yet he keeps talking out loud, as he was in the speech, which I heard a little bit of, saying the same thing and promising that he's going to overturn it. I think it's very destructive. Clearly, the French and the Europeans are telling him not to do it, along with all his staff and all his cabinet members. But the president often ignores that. He did it on the Paris Peace Accord, where he was told by all his cabinet to stay in. He got out, and we'll face that deadline in mid-October. So I think it's a very nervous time, if you ask me.
It is a nervous time, but it's also an exciting time, You always have very contradictory things going on all at the same time. As we are speaking, President Trump of the United States is still delivering his speech at the UN General Assembly. Usually every head of state have 15 minutes or so to deliver a speech, but earlier we've also seen President Obama giving 38-minute long speech, and Fidel Castro, for example, giving a few 100-minute speech. And so President Trump is still going on as we are speaking. Certainly, CGTN, together with World Insight with Tian,